Hello, everybody. Welcome to this event at Wheeler Institute for Business and Development, London Business School. My name is Sergei Guriev. I'm a professor of economics and dean at London Business School. And I'm here just to introduce Daron Acemoglu, who needs no introduction in this room. But just let me say that Daron is an institute professor of economics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's also winner of John Bates Clark Medal 2005 and Nobel Laureate in Economics in 2024 for his outstanding work on all kinds of issues and questions, but probably most importantly, this is what Nobel Prize Committee says, for institutional and political economy. Daron has already given this talk in this very room. Daron has actually received an honorary doctorate from London Business School. Daron has taught in our PhD program. This is something that people at LSE, where he received a PhD, don't want to remember. I was there last night, and they didn't mention LBS at all. But I would just say that for me, Daron is an exemplary scholar who cares about the world, cares about policy, cares about changing lives for the better, is very passionate about research that he does, and also amazingly productive. So the biggest puzzle is how Daron manages to write so many papers and books at the same time. I remember very vividly in 2005, Daron and Jim Robinson, his co-winner of Nobel Prize, published a book about economic origins of dictatorship and democracy, which is actually a great breakthrough in how we think about regime changes and democratizations. And then while I was finishing reading this book, because I was teaching this stuff, Daron suddenly publishes a 1,000-page textbook on economic growth. So we have a common friend and co-author, Konstantin Sonin. His theory was there are doppelgangers, so working at the same time on papers and on books. And of course, Daron and Jim also published a global bestseller, Why Nations Fail. As somebody who's taught political economy of development, I can tell you this is the book that we use to teach political economy, changes in institutions. And it's also read throughout the world. It's translated in all languages, and policymakers think about this as the Bible of political economy and economic history. But of course, Daron didn't stop there. He published with Jim Narrow Corridor. And then recently, Power and Progress, which is a very relevant book, not just covering the economic history of technological change, but also how we should think about future of AI, how political institutions may determine our technological choices, driving the future of work. And Daron, among other things, is also a co-director of MIT Initiative on Shaping Future of Work, as he's also a labor economist, among other things, but also a political economist. That book is a very important book. By the time I finished reading this book, Daron's announced that the new book is coming up next spring, and this is what Daron is going to talk about today. Now, I should disclose that I went to this talk yesterday in London School of Economics, and it's going to be a very interesting talk. Daron asked me why I should listen to the same talk twice, and I'll tell you a short story. In late 1990s, I was at MIT for a year of a postdoctoral study, and at MIT, in addition to big seminars, there are also internal lunches, and I spoke in one of those lunches. Daron, of course, was there, giving me excellent feedback. But I also attended a skit party at MIT. And they said that the new department chair will introduce new regulation that Daron cannot go to more than 5 lunches a week. So Daron is somebody who really cares about colleagues, about society. And this is such a pleasure to have Daron here with us talking about probably the most important issue of our societies today, remaking liberalism, past, present, and future of liberalism. Daron will talk for 20 minutes, then Elias Papaioannou, co-director of Wheeler Institute of Business and Development, will ask him some questions, and then in the end, we'll open for questions from the floor. Daron, thank you very much for coming, and welcome to LBS.
I don't need that. I think I have this. Yeah. My great pleasure to be back here. Thank you for that lovely introduction, although I think I'm speaking for 30 minutes. I can try to cut it on the fly, but probably not a good idea. So Sergei gave the bottom line away, so I'm going to talk about my new book. So why? Why a new book? Well, I think we are at the cusp of some very major changes, and I believe a lot of them are about ideas, and it takes an idea to beat an idea, and we need new ideas about liberalism. And we need new ideas about liberalism because I will try to argue, and I remain convinced, that over the last 300 years, and especially over the last 150 years, liberalism, both as a philosophy but also as a way of organizing practical politics, has been responsible for some of the most important improvements about individual rights, creating rule of law, about building a level playing field, helping the more disadvantaged and less well-off members of society. So by liberalism here, I mean not classical liberalism, but something that has, I think, become the more driving force of both 19th century and 20th century ideas, which is something that has a little bit more of the left liberalism in it, so a commitment to redistribution and helping the less well-off people in society as well. And liberalism, I think, has been a very important part of the belief in the progress that different human societies and communities can achieve. The big advances that I will argue have come from liberalism have had two phases. One was when liberalism was in opposition. So when many of the important reforms, such as extension of the franchise, early welfare state reforms, better infrastructure starting from health, education, etc., throughout the West were responses to these liberal challenges. But also in part of the 20th century, in the early phases of liberalism's ascendancy to power, liberalism delivered on three promises that it has made implicitly. Those three premises I will call sharing, meaning creating progress, economic growth, and sharing that progress. That was always quite essential for the liberal project. As early as 1840s, when Chartists were fighting for the right to vote and some associated changes in the UK, one of their mottos, one of their most important slogans was, universal suffrage is a knife and fork question, bread and cheese question, meaning that this is a way to build sharing in society. Second, public services, or drains, to paraphrase the once poet laureate of this country, John Betjeman, who said, our nation stands for democracy and proper drains. And indeed, the early phases of democracy were very much about building much better public services. Illiteracy disappeared, health improved tremendously. Now, in most of the West, there are tremendously better public services in terms of infrastructure, road, and other things that people craved and didn't have in the early phases, either under authoritarian regimes or under more conservative-led governments. And that was part of the reason why, following the Beveridge report, for example, British voters put the Labour government in power, following, the quite considerable success of conservatives or Churchill during the war. And third, of course, axiomatically, voice, that people wanted voice, and liberal agenda of protecting their ability to speak and enabling them to participate in politics was a very important part of that. Now, the way that those things happened is very important, and I'm going to talk about that. But in contrast to that, I think today there is a general feeling around the world that liberalism is in crisis. And I don't think this is just misinformation and social media, although those have played a role. It's really that liberalism hasn't lived up to its promises. Part of it is that the world has become more complicated in a way that I'm going to explain, but also liberalism has not adjusted to being in power. So I think it was a better movement when it was in opposition, and it hasn't adjusted to the same extent to being the establishment power. And let me tell that story briefly, and then I will explain why I think liberalism was a very important part of this success. So I think the essential part of what happened in the post-war era, especially the 3 decades that followed, 3.5 decades that followed World War II, but its origins are really in the early 20th century, is one in which you may call the Industrial Compact, meaning a model in which the economy is based on markets and ability of firms to expand with new technology and new strategies for reaching markets, especially mass markets. And in the process of doing so, they created the most natural pathway for shared prosperity. For firms to expand, they needed to hire labor. And as they went into their business of trying to expand in a labor market that has some elements of competition, that meant pushing up wages, and increases in wages is the surefire and perhaps the only surefire way of creating shared prosperity, because it ensures that the earnings of many groups in society are increasing at the same time. And mass production relied on very diverse skills, from engineers to clerical workers to manual workers to construction workers, semi-skilled workers, etc., the wages of all groups increasing at the same time. In country after country, the UK, US, France, Germany, you see a tremendous increase in wages, and pretty much across the board. This wasn't just markets. Markets were bolstered by the right types of institutions, and 2 are very important. One was trade unions, so making sure that it wasn't coercion, it wasn't monopsony, it wasn't some other things that enabled firms to actually hire the labor. The second one was democracy, and in particular, what I'm going to call self-government, because it starts from bottom up, the community level, and it expanded to the national economy. And that was very important because in some sense, unions are about self-government. And it was very, very important because all these public services that I mentioned, which were synergistic with this agenda, also came from the democratic impulse that there was a demand for these things, and to get elected, you needed to deliver them at the local level and you needed to deliver them at the national level. Of course, things have worked differently. The role of local government has been different in the UK than the US, but I think this local participation in politics was very, very important. All of this is bolstered by practical politics and ideas. And I think if you go back to the nature of liberalism, at least the kind of liberalism that I'm going to try to describe and defend here, that it had elements that were very much bracketing those 2 philosophical and practical politics things. Philosophically, I think the most important elements of liberalism is the idea that you need no new knowledge. New knowledge comes from different types of experimentation. And that knowledge needs to be created, and that knowledge needs to be shared. And by knowledge, I don't just mean technical information. I don't mean just science. But a lot of what we do as human communities, and community is going to be very important, is about adapting to a changing world. If you look at humans, more than 20,000 years ago, living in hunter-gatherer society, bands of 100, 200 people, look at the empires, look at city-states, look at city republics, look at multinational countries and nation-states. All of those require big adaptations. Even more so, our possibilities for living with new technologies, new social arrangements, including globalization. All of those require a range of social knowledge to be built. How do we deal with them? How do we create new pathways, new ways of both changing our communities and perhaps sometimes changing how we deal with other people? So all of that is knowledge that needs to be created. Nobody gave a cookbook to the Dutch, for example, that how to build their communities to deal with rivers and sea levels that always expanded. They had to work that. They had to develop their own, what people call the polder model of very strange cooperation by the standards of anywhere else that you see in the West, for example. But creating knowledge is not enough. I can come up with new knowledge. If it just stays with me, it's not going to have any big impact. So knowledge needs to be shared, and sharing happens within a trusted circle. And that's where communities come in. Communities, as people who have solidarity, meaning mutual respect and mutual caring and the historical trust that they have built are essential for the sharing of that knowledge. But more than that, actually a lot of the social adaptation that I'm talking about is not something you can do by yourself. You cannot by yourself develop new institutions and new norms. Developing new institutions and norms are actually community-level experimentation. So communities are, again, absolutely important. Now, this might strike you as something a little bit from the left field, because if you look at the modern liberal tradition, community doesn't appear in it. This is actually not true historically, that the early liberal thinkers, especially those that go to the Roman Republic, and were very much about the community aspect. But that has actually one of the things that has disappeared, and that disappearance is partly about ideas, partly about other things, which I'm going to talk about, but it is actually quite consequential nonetheless. Now, the practical politics of it, perhaps by mistake, sort of worked out this way. So the industrial compact that I described, but again, you can go trace this back to the 19th century and early 20th century, was all about doing new things. Before Henry Ford, for example, built the mass production system starting with cars, which is a very different way of organizing both the factory and also the way of accessing the market, nobody would have thought of that. And that information gets built, that gets shared. Markets play a particularly important role in it, but the practical politics is very important as well. It couldn't happen in a way that Henry Ford, despite the fact that he wanted, could become a monopsonist and coerce his laborers. And it couldn't happen in a way that was non-democratic, because starting from local politics, emanating all the way up, this democratic politics was playing a particularly important role. And if you look at the coalitions supporting it, you see the diversity of the coalitions. So why is today liberalism is in crisis? Of course, the fact that I said it is in power, and that might have required some adjustments, is part of it. But a bigger part, or at least the starting point, I'm going to argue, is computers. Computers essentially destroyed the industrial compact. And they created what I'm going to call a post-industrial economy, but even more consequentially, the political economy of post-industrial economy led to a post-industrial politics. The post-industrial economy starts with computers that create already a wedge between educated and less educated groups. Of course, everything is a social construct. Thinking of the college educated as a group is a social construct, but it's from the fact that actually everybody now in many industrialized countries feels that way already says that there is some truth to that social construct, even if it's an exaggeration and simplification as well. But computers, by their early design, were tools that work very well with, or could work reasonably well with office workers, especially very skilled office workers, but weren't particularly useful for the less educated workers. So that was already sort of driving a wedge that these new technologies are empowering and increasing the earning capacity of one group. But the really consequential change came when digital technologies became a tool for automation. Starting with numerically controlled machinery, then software systems for mainframe, software systems for personal computers, and industrial robotics and advanced automated machinery, what you see is the ability of digital technologies to automate tasks that were previously done either by manual workers on factory floors or office clerical workers, simple routine tasks in offices. And that severs the obvious link that I mentioned from now firms can create new markets, new technologies, expand, but they don't need to hire more labor now. They can rely more on automation technologies. And once that link is severed, you see that the basic channel of sharing that existed in the industrial compact is not going to work anymore. Now, there are many other layers to this story, and some of them need to be discussed. Shifts from, parts of the liberal agenda to deregulation, unions becoming less powerful, which is also important in how automation technologies were introduced, globalization, absolutely. But I want to put one important other element on the table, which together with automation really transformed the opportunities for low education manual workers and multiplied the opportunities and economic standing of more educated, more cognitive workers. That's for the economists in the room will recognize this as the Baumol-Cost disease, which is that when economic growth happens in uneven rates across different sectors and people want to consume more or less everything, then there needs to be a reallocation of resources, especially labor, from the fast expanding sectors to more slowly expanding sectors. And throughout the automation era, but even perhaps arguably before then, the Baumol-Cost disease means that manufacturing will have to shed labor, and low productivity growth sectors such as education, administration, healthcare, and so on will have to gain labor. That's why costs go up, because those sectors cannot keep up with manufacturing. But the more important consequence of the Baumol-Cost disease is that the people who lose their jobs and the people who gain jobs are not the same. The people who lose jobs are, again, the manual workers, but health, education, and all these other sectors don't require manual workers. They require more cognitive workers. So Baumol-Cost disease and automation both started creating a complete new economy in which there are more and more opportunities for people like us, and fewer opportunities for manual workers or routine office workers. All of this, I think, would have been discombobulating enough, except that they got greatly amplified by the fact that, together with post-industrial economy, we ended up with a post-industrial politics. And the post-industrial politics, the story, is much more about us as well. So the educated, which were about 10% of the population in 1940, are now in the United States close to 50%. In the UK, the increase has been slower, but so that sheer number would have been a big game changer. But there are two things more than that sheer number. One is that the educated, because they are getting more income, have also gained greatly in social status. In both the United States and Europe, income is status. So as you are becoming so much more enriched and empowered economically, their political power also increased. But secondly, I believe that the way that the dynamics of social values and lives of the educated have evolved have added greatly to this change. Every group will be more cohesive when they share values. And I think the very fact of going to college and getting an education is something that creates these coherent values. But over time, these coherent values have also started changing because the experiences of the educated and the less educated have diverged. And you can see so many elements of this divergence. In World War II in the United States, I should check the same numbers for the UK, the college educated were slightly more likely to serve in the war. By Vietnam War, it was completely different. Essentially, the educated did not serve in the war. It was all low education manual workers. It's the same today. You know, the United States has fought 2 major wars, and pretty much nobody with a college education went and served. They didn't even notice that there was a war. If you look at the 1950s, the values of the college-educated and non-college educated are very congruent on many social issues. By the 2000s, it had completely changed. In the 1950s, the college-educated and non-college educated lived in the same communities. They married similarly, they socialized similarly. It's completely changed. So postgraduates and graduates are essentially almost impossible for them to marry somebody without a college education. They live in very different neighborhoods. They have very different lives, especially in mega cities, which have become so globalized. They have completely different experiences. That would have very major consequences, but especially so when coupled with the fact that their social status has increased, but also politics has changed. So in both the UK and the US, and several other countries to a similar extent as well, the center-right used to be the party of the educated. The center-right used to vote more for the educated, the manual workers, especially through unions, but also for other reasons, used to vote for the center-left. And the divide was even starker if you look at the very elite institutions. So in the United States, Ivy Leaguers, when they were in government, were much, much more likely to be in the Republican Party than the Democratic Party in the 1920s and 1930s. Today, there are essentially no Ivy Leaguers left, with a few exceptions like somebody very famous right now, in Republican politics. They're overwhelmingly in democratic politics. In the UK, in the US, France, and Germany, now manual workers, low education workers vote more for the right, and the college educated overwhelmingly vote for the left. Now, the liberal college educated are committed to some amount of equality. So if you look at their preferences, they do want greater equality, and that's actually a priority, but with some exceptions I'm going to come to. Except that the way that they want to achieve that is completely out of whack with what the lower education people want. And despite the commitment that they profess, there is a sin of omission here, because essentially, while liberal parties have been in power, both from the center and the center left, inequality has skyrocketed in many countries, including especially in the UK and the US. So this, I think, is not unrelated to the fact that there is less possibility for building solidarity, because you cannot build solidarity unless you have common experiences, and that those common experiences have ceased. But there's one other aspect to understanding the current crisis of liberalism, in my opinion, which is very important for why people feel not only that the shared prosperity promise has completely collapsed during the post-industrial period, but also why the public services and the voice element has collapsed. And in the United States, the numbers are really striking, that if you look at the ability of governments, both local and national, to deliver the kinds of services that people want, it's completely collapsed. But even more so, people report to be largely voiceless. So in the United States, in Pew surveys, almost 90%, more than 85% of people say politicians do not speak for people like me. They don't care about what people like me think. So, and again, you can blame some of this on social media, etc., but I think it is also indicative of something broader. And to understand that, we have to recognize that every social group is heterogeneous, but that heterogeneity is much more important for the college educated. In particular, again, simplifying, the college educated can be divided into two groups. So those who are the emblematic example of doing the very high-powered jobs and having these high earnings, let's call them, for lack of a better term, the cognitive elite, is actually a relatively small part of the college educated. In the United States, if you look at inequality, it has skyrocketed, but those men especially who have a college degree but not a postgraduate degree, they haven't experienced much of an increase in their earnings. It's really this group with postgraduate degrees, and if you add to them those from the Ivy League with very elite education, like in computer science, etc., that essentially accounts for most of it. The rest, let's call them, for lack of a better term, mass college educated, have of course the same aspirations, but haven't really achieved to the same extent of economic success. And again, when income is status in a country like the United States or the UK, their social status hasn't kept up with those of the cognitive elite. If you look at the values of these two groups, they initially look quite different. And that could give you hope that there could be coalitions that bring parts of the educated together into solidarity and cooperation with other groups in society. But it hasn't worked out that way. And part of the big divide is about their values on inequality, markets, etc. So the cognitive elite thinks markets work very well, success is justified, you shouldn't mess with markets too much, you shouldn't redistribute too much, and if you're going to redistribute, you should do it in the lightest possible way. The mass college educated has more sort of left-leaning ideas on many things. So that's one big divide. So if you're going to find a common denominator, that's not going to be very easy. But there's another axis in which a common denominator was very strong, and especially when you bring into the picture a third actor, the tech sector. The tech sector which is the nexus of many of the technologies and much of the earnings, also, just like the college educated that are the mass college educated and the cognitive elite, had a particular set of cultural values. Those cultural values emphasize a particular type of individualism, global universal values, especially given that this is part of what the college education imparts, but also the tech sector's dependence on foreign labor, both skilled and unskilled. And the major point of coalition between the tech sector, the cognitive elite, and the mass college educated evolved to be around cultural values. Except that the problem is that that agreement went very much against the values of the less educated groups, which were already losing economically, but also it went against the community basis of many of the local politics and local participation in politics and local activities. So I think that set the scene over the last 3 decades for a major backlash, which is essential to the crisis of liberalism. So in some sense, there are the sins of omission, which is the educated elites not developing good strategies for dealing with the inequality, where technology was going, and how many groups in society were being left behind. And then the sins of commission came from the cultural politics agenda, which formed the common denominator for these educated groups, bolstered by the tech sector. So that diagnosis, therefore, explains in the coming together of the post-industrial economics and post-industrial politics, both why the shared prosperity promise of liberalism and liberal democracy failed, and why the regulation, the public good provisions or the public services failed, because local governments and together with that agenda, some of the regulatory approaches didn't sort of work for the post-industrial economy, and why the voice part of it at least felt as a bygone for many people in diverse communities. So on the basis of this, my sort of view is that the main way in which we can remake liberalism is what I'm going to call working class liberalism. So working class liberalism has to first go back to the aspirations of the early liberalism that brings community majorly together. Second, it has to increase the focus on the progress part, in particular economic growth. Today, we live in a relatively prosperous world by historical standards, but the hunger for jobs, for income growth, is palpable in every community. So what many communities really want is more job opportunities. So shifting the focus to providing such job opportunities would be a very important part of that agenda. Why is that feasible? It's feasible because, and this I'm not going to get into the details, but this was my talk 2 years ago from the Power and Progress. If the sins of omission did not happen, there are both institutional and technological arrangements that would be much better for shared prosperity, in particular what I call pro-worker technology or pro-worker AI. And there is a lot of flexibility in creating those kinds of tools, which would be a conduit for generating more works for workers who are different levels of skills. So that requires a very different regulatory agenda, not regulate the details of things, but focus the regulation on AI and other things. And meet those communities on the parts of what they so much crave, which is more economic opportunities, more opportunities for the belief that their children are going to be better off, and use those ideas as the basis for increasing that community level participation. But it won't stop there. I think there is more that is needed. On the going back to my account for what was inspiring and what worked for liberalism, self-government was a very important part of it. So if you read many newspapers and influential thinkers today, you will have perhaps internalized or at least heard, the notion that there is an irreconcilable conflict between liberalism and democracy. All ideas of illiberal democracy. But actually, the liberalism that I'm describing, which is very much along the lines of what the Republican political philosophy, going back to ancient Rome, Machiavelli, and so on, is that liberalism is completely symbiotic with self-government. You cannot have liberalism without self-government. And in fact, once you bring the community level, it is very much essential to have that self-government. So self-government means communities actually make choices both about how to govern themselves and how to participate in politics. Now, part of that is about offering those communities the things that they crave, such as jobs and opportunities. But part of it is also about cultural economics, meaning how to actually accommodate the different cultural values of different communities. Now, obviously, a liberal society cannot survive if it's schizophrenic. So you let communities to completely abridge the individual freedoms of their members, like they cannot go to school. So we sometimes allow that for the Amish, but that shouldn't be part of the local values. But different communities having different thoughts, expressions, values, preferences, I think should be very important. In fact, if you subscribed or at least nodded your head when I talked about community level experimentation, you cannot have that if all communities are cookie cutter versions of each other. They would all do the same thing. So communities being different, both in terms of their participation in politics, their economic organization, their values, is actually potentially a good thing. In fact, what I'm going to say next may strike you as quite odd or provocative. But if you go to the 1980s and read early philosophical writings from the 80s and the 1990s on multiculturalism, they articulated a set of ideas that said it is important for established ethnic communities, religious communities, immigrant communities to have enough self-government and enough possibilities to maintain their different cultures. But essentially, under this post-industrial politics, that same possibility wasn't admitted for native and sometimes more conservative communities, and I think that's part of the backlash. So how to actually make that part of the liberal agenda, I think, is going to be central to the remaking liberalism and a working class liberalism that emphasizes more the points of agreement and the possibilities for this diversity. That's all I have to say, and I look forward to your comments and the discussions. Thank you.
So thanks, Daron. It's always a pleasure to welcome you at LBS and think about those issues. As a caveat, there are no slides, there are no books, so I couldn't do much preparation.
The best, you don't have to waste much time.
I did not. But actually, the preparation I did was going over, after some books I had, I was looking for some other kind of books. It was a really good refresher of the old ideas of liberalism. So I will start with some succinct questions, and then I'll try to go to more the bigger philosophical debate on what is liberalism today. Just as an introduction, the Oxford Dictionary defines liberalism first as willingness to respect and accept behavior or opinions different from one's own. Second, a political and social philosophy that promotes individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, and free enterprise. So Daron presented actually a great academic paper earlier on in the economic subject area. So how do you square now liberalism with the statistics that you showed earlier, where there is declining trust, not only on democracy, but also on the core institutions that safeguard democracy, and also, I would say, free enterprise and civil liberties?
I think that's, again, it is multi-causal. There are many things going on. But a large part of it is the undoing of local self-government capabilities, so people actually feeling disempowered, and especially feeling that the values that were imposed on them don't cohere with their priorities. And I think so the shift towards more cultural economics as the common denominator of a lot of the center left is a very important part of that.
So I have a quote for your book, since it's on the writing. I will ask you who wrote it. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. My colleague Josep, I think, has an answer.
Since you, I'm going to say it's Foucault, but I'm just suspecting.
Actually,
Gramsci.
It's close, it's Engels. And then Antonio Gramsci elaborated on this idea of ideological dominance, or this imagery. And actually, I think what you describe is that in economics, now in emerging markets that I co-teach with Paolo Surico, we discuss about hyperglobalization in the 90s and the 2000s. As economists, we focus on the economics. I think you stressed that there was also kind of an effort of the rulings elite, the globalized, you stressed the technology part of the dominance. And I think what we see now, post-2010 perhaps a bit earlier, this, in some sense, counter-revolution or counter-attack to that. Do I read you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the backlash is slow, starting earlier, but yes, it accelerates. And now, of course, cultural entrepreneurship plays a role, and both talk show hosts on the right in starting earlier, social media, but more importantly, I think a lot of anti-liberal ideas are now gaining traction. That's why at the beginning I said it takes an idea to beat an idea. If you look at the last 80 years, all new ideas are coming from liberal left. And that's no longer true. Now you can say Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, they're very, very important. They had very consequential effects. But if you look at, they are still at the edges of the liberal tradition. They do not deny any of the elements, including the willingness to help the least disadvantaged. They want more deregulation, much weaker labor unions. But right now, we are seeing completely anti-liberal ideas, both in the United States, but all over the world. And that's the change, and I think that's the measure of the crisis of liberalism.
Let me push you a bit on the self-governance. So if I was to see globalization, actually here, we're all here thanks to globalization. Our jobs, to a great extent, benefit from globalization. And then we did see, however, some communities that in the epoch of hyper-globalization did go to local communities. But these communities are not the heterogeneous types that you referred in the end of your remarks. They are in a particular religious sect or a particular cultural element. So I think we do see a lot of self-governance, but perhaps not with diversity, but with homogeneity, plus an ambition, I would say, to dominate others.
Yeah, I don't know about the ambition to dominate others. That's probably always there. And communities, I didn't have time to get into this, but are always two-edged swords. They help because of the norms, because of the trust, because of the ability to create this solidarity, which is important for collective action. But communities always create norms that prevent certain freedoms. So that's why it's very important to have the sort of the right principles to guide that. In some sense, I think liberalism has always been about trade-offs. So it's always easy to have ideologies that preach simple solutions. Libertarianism is one, reduce governments and let the market do everything. Extreme progressivism is another one. We know the truth. We know the social contract. We're going to impose it on everybody. But in most cases, you have trade-offs. There are no perfect solutions. So you have to grapple with the fact that some of these communities are imposing things on their members, while at the same time they are critical for the self-actualization of the ability of many of their members to sort of pursue the lives that they want and engage in politics and etc.
Yeah, let me jump on that. So I think many people in this room and the fora we meet and our friends kind of see the rising inequality. All of us might have some prescriptions for some solution. Some might entail redistribution. We can debate on how redistribution will happen. As you rightly pointed out, I think even Reagan and Thatcher would say that with the policies, they benefit the middle and the lower middle class. But how do you deal with the issue that in an epoch of very high inequality, plummeting social mobility, there isn't that much demand. I think it's fair I think there is demand, but there's clearly not the dominant force in UK politics or US politics or German politics, a very 30s style socialist agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I think the elements of cultural and social change are very complex. So it is true that different types of ideas are popular with different segments of the population. Going back to one of the things that I said, two of the things I said just as illustration. One is, if you look at what the college educated say they want to do or they should do for helping the inequality problem is tax and redistribute. If you ask people who don't have a college degree, they don't like those policies. Their preferences are minimum wage, stronger unions, job protections, job programs, and trade restrictions. And which ones do central left parties have opted for the last 30 years is the former. So that's one of the elements that really sort of stands out when you do that. But the other very important thing is that the ideas that are now spreading are very different from the sort of the deregulation, et cetera, approach of Thatcher, Reagan, low tax or different types of tax, different progressivity. It's much more anti-liberal ideas of reversing political participation, having strong leaders, Schmittian ideas of strong executives, thinking that freedom of speech only means freedom of your speech and not of other groups. So it's this very different set of anti-liberal ideas that are gaining traction, especially on the right, but perhaps you can identify a few places in the left where there are some ideas like that as well.
Well, again, so my reading of your answer is that there is demand for redistribution, but perhaps not the type of redistribution that the globalized left-leaning elites advocated.
There is very strong demand for better job opportunities. And there is disagreement about how that's going to be achieved. And there is also probably some natural and some manufactured disagreements about how the government can help in that process.
Because if I was to push you on that, it's just a thought, perhaps people are not expressing a very big desire, old style at least, of redistribution because they are so dissatisfied and non-convinced that the state can never deliver. They have lost perhaps trust of the...
There is that as well. But despite that, most people are, there are a lot of low education people, the majority that would say, minimum wages or job programs are definitely worthwhile.
And let me conclude my Q&A because many people here came to ask your thoughts. Now, if we were in the past 20 years in an era where the globalized elite was trying of dominating its narrative or its imagery, if I was to use Gramsci terms, now I think you see a lot of a new kind of elite, the techno elite that you discuss a lot in your previous book, Power and Progress. Do you see this actually taking over?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the particular coalition that formed within the educated group would not have been possible without the tech sector's values becoming influential, but also the tech sector, which I think is not uniform, obviously, has now been a major sort of breeding ground for anti-liberal ideas. So, in some sense, the tech sector could become dominant from two different channels. One, as it has become dominant and continue to become dominant via the center-left throughout the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, or a complete reversal and now through the extreme right.
Okay. So let me just now open the floor for questions. I think please try to keep your questions short so we take more questions. Please make a very brief introduction.
So I think that's a very important question. And this is what the part of the bigger picture that I skipped because I was short of time, but also I was referring to some of the other stuff that I have written, which is unwise, of course. But I don't think we should equate efficiency with labor saving. So the drive of the last 50 years has been exactly that we achieve efficiency mostly via automation. And there are different ways of achieving efficiency, and in particular, economic vibrancy often comes from the introduction of new goods, new services, new tasks. And those are not necessarily labor saving, they can create new job opportunities as well. And that is the basis of my claim that there is a pro-worker direction of technology, pro-worker direction of AI, and that's going to be a very important building block of what I'm calling working class liberalism. Now, you can disagree with with the feasibility of that or the achievability of that from a political point of view. And I think Elon Musk's sort of both economic and political persona is very much that's not where we're going, and that's not where he wants us to go. So the agenda of concentrating power in the hands of a few people is very synergistic with the agenda of sidelining labor. So in some sense, the notion of efficiency as purely labor-saving, automating, is very much complementary to saying also the founders should rule everything, including society. Yeah, I think that's very, very important, and I believe that is a very defining direction of the crisis, because, you know, the agenda of possible progress, both in terms of adapting to a very different world. I mean, look, just the very fact of having social media means we have a huge adaptation problem. How schools should be organized, how families should be organized, how social networks should be organized. That's one of acquiring information and sharing information. That requires trust. It requires trust within communities. It requires trust between communities. And that's the kind of trust that we have lost. And why have we lost that? You know, again, some of it is propaganda, but the fact that the decline in, say, in the United States, in Congress or courts, is very much parallel to the decline in science and the decline in trust in science, I think is telling that there are some common processes at work. But it's very, very costly.
So I'll come to a doctor, actually, student. But allow me to say a question here, which I had based on the two questions. So we're in a business school. And I think businesses were a key driving force, both of the globalization epoch and also of the reforms of Thatcher and Reagan that spread globally. Mm-hmm. Do you see a role for businesses and business education, perhaps?
Well, absolutely. So again, if we're gonna, so the part that I didn't, again, come back to, which I intended, but I didn't want to go on for a long time, is that why did I mention the Baumol cost disease? Well, it's part of the rise, the emergence of post-industrial economics, but it's also part of the solution. Because the Baumol cost disease is going to continue. It implies that it's going to be sectors such as healthcare, education, business and information services that are going to expand. So if you want to create good jobs for workers without a college degree, it has to be in those sectors. So if you can create good jobs for diverse skills, that's going to be a game changer. So that will turn the Baumol cost disease into a helper rather than a hinderer for the agenda of sharing. And why is that possible? Well, it's possible because these are the sectors that are craving new services and new goods. And that's where you're going to need these diverse things. So I'm not a believer that the future we want is either one in which 90% of the population is college educated, as the college is conceived at the moment. We need skills, we need training, we need very different types of possibilities, but it's not going to be liberal art education for everybody. And I'm also terrified of a future in which 50% of the population essentially doesn't contribute at all to economic surplus, because that would be a very dystopian world, very unequal in terms of social status as well as other things. So the solution is to find ways for businesses to thrive while doing these new tasks and services, and that's where business leadership comes. So if businesses are all in the mode of, okay, it's AI, and AI means automate, or we are just at the cusp of AGI, and that's what we just need to wait for that, none of that would happen. So business agency would have to be, coming up with these new strategies, recognizing new needs, which are plenty with demographic change, climate change, new changes, social changes. There will be a lot of things that businesses can do that's out of the box that can contribute to that.
Great. I think it's the time to take a question from a doctor who becomes a manager at LBS.
Thank you, Dr. Acemoglu, so much for coming and joining us at LBS. It's a great honor to have you. I just wanted to ask very quickly about how you're contrasting liberalism with kind of its opposite of authoritarianism, which is what we see so much. And we hear this narrative a lot that liberalism has lost a lot of answers in political economy and for lower classes, and people are going to authoritarian, even regimes or examples around the world to find solutions to things. My real point is is that actually true, or is liberalism the only system where you can actually are allowed to measure and express opinions that show problems? For example, during the pandemic, in the UK, you can measure COVID cases, you can make plans, you can have official data, you have a COVID problem. In North Korea, there are 0 COVID cases, there's no COVID problem, there's no problems at all. So is liberalism the only type of political system that allows itself to be critiqued and potentially improved, and that's why it may give the impression of a crisis? Or is there authoritarianism actually has some answers that we don't?
Well, so I think it's a multifaceted question, and I'm not sure whether I can give a simple enough answer. But my belief is that authoritarianism doesn't have the solution to any of the problems that we're facing, precisely because it's not going to cultivate individual autonomy and these individual level experimentation, information sharing. Moreover, I think authoritarianism doesn't have a good track record of dealing with any kind of social adaptation. So even if authoritarian governments could deal with some technical issues, I think they have no track record of doing these sort of broader collective knowledge building. But I wouldn't say that the problems of liberalism are just that because it's more open to discussion, its problems are showing. These are true crises, and we can go into the details. And also part of it is that liberalism itself has become much less tolerant of dissent. So look at social media. Okay, social media is different, but you don't see that people who would identify themselves broadly as liberal are as committed to criticism and critical thinking and questioning of basic principles as I think they might have been, although nothing is perfect, 40, 50 years ago. So I think the picture is complex in that way.
And if I was to add, because I had a similar note in my long notes here, that one of the 4 principles of liberalism in this great book I recommend by Edmund Foucault is that they respect people regardless of who they are and what they say. And perhaps, if I read you correctly, is that perhaps the liberal elites globally kind of did not tick this requirement. Please.
So thank you very much for doing this. I am Musi, I'm a MSc student in economics at LSE. So my question is, if AI development is happening faster than democratic institutions can adapt, are we basically letting private companies write the rules for everyone else? And if yes, what is the path forward?
So absolutely, that would be a concern. The only reason why I wouldn't say that's deadly is because AI is not going as fast as I think some people claim. So here is like the thought experiment. I am very worried about social media. And I would be extremely even more worried if social media meant that a company like Facebook has all of your information and can use that information in ways that really could manipulate you, exploit you, etc., except they cannot. Just look at their AI content moderation system. It's just a complete failure. So our capability to process information is still way, way, way short of that scary future. So we are heading towards that future, but in baby steps. So there's a lot of things that we can do to reverse it. In the short run, there are lots of other problems that social media is creating, which is actually complicating that. So I think regulation of social media is something we should take seriously. So in some sense, one other part of this working class liberalism is to redirect regulation away from procedures to important issues like social media, AI, and of course, individual freedoms.
Please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Hello. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry. There's a growing concern about demographic changes, in the sense that throughout the West, most countries have gone through a declining population growth rate, and it's even below replacement rate. And the point is that many of these countries actually went through this a structural transformation, you would say, in terms of human capital in a post-war world. And that coincided with that demographic boom. The point is that many countries that are not in the West are going through that demographic boom, but nonetheless, they do not have the capabilities to invest significantly in human capital. So do you have any idea about the prospects for long-run growth?
Demographic change is very rapid and is going to be very disequilibrating in some important ways. But I actually think that at the margin it may be helpful. First of all, demographic change, the slowing down of the population growth and the aging of the population means there will be labor scarcity. Labor scarcity helps the agenda of creating good jobs and high wages. But second thing is, one of the big areas in which these conflicts have occurred is immigration, because immigration is a major issue for many local communities. And the evidence is that it's not so much about economics, it's much more about cultural issues. But nonetheless, economics is an intermediating factor, and demographic change is going to make it more and more necessary to have immigration. So with the right policies and the approaches, I think the conflicts over immigration can be much better handled in a society that's aging in some sense, or that's not having rapid population growth.
Please go ahead.
Hello, Doğukan Konuşmaz from London Business School. I just wanted to ask, today we talked about some big economic and political disruptions relating to liberalism, but also for some years now you've been talking about a further divergence between countries who produce high-tech equipments, but also populations, as you said, like high education people versus the lower class. And I just wanted to ask, policy-wise, what kind of changes do you think will be needed to happen? And then what do you think will be some popular changes that everyone will get behind in the future with regards to this further divergence? But what are some of the tough stuff that will be very unpopular? So,
it's a very multifaceted question. So first of all, I have unabashedly focused on the West here. So obviously 6 billion people are outside of that. That needs to be taken into account. Now, I think there are three elements that are relevant for when we think about the remaining 6 billion people. One of them is that, oftentimes the prestige of different institutional arrangements can be damaged or built in the core and then spreads to the periphery. So the financial crisis, for example, damaged the reputation of democratic institutions and democratic regulation all around the world, even though mostly it was the United States. If you are able to turn AI into something that creates jobs for people, that would be very useful for the developing world. But also, I think the future of regulation in the topics that I say are important, individual rights may be the exception here, but pandemics, AI, social media, those are global problems, so they require international cooperation, and we have essentially also damaged the fabric of international cooperation for a variety of reasons.
Please.
You can. Okay. Thank you for sharing, Daron. And thank you for Elias insightful critical questions. And for me, I'm Monica from Sloan program, and I want to ask a question between the relationship between the technology, the law, and the AI governance. So my question is, it seems that the TFP play more and more key role for the growth, especially for the increasing the productivity, and it seems almost all the countries, the regulators, and encourage the technology, the AI, and increasing the new innovation. But different country has the attitude and the action. There's a gap. For example, for the US and the China, it's like they take more active action to embrace the new technology and encouraging the innovation. But in the Europe, it's another picture. There's more strict regulations and about the governance and the cybersecurity and the data protection. So my question is about the third one is AI, how we can to evaluate the AI governance and to balance the innovation and to control the risk. Thank you.
So I think I would like to answer this question very much in line with the question that the first question that was asked. So in some sense, despite all of this focus on efficiency, we are actually not seeing that. We're not seeing great results. So you mentioned TFP, total factor productivity growth. It's actually been slower over the last 30 years than ever. So, and part of that, I think, is because, just focusing on the automation benefits of efficiency has been a losing proposition. And that's why I think there is a future for pro-worker technologies. And in fact, I think if you look at what I was trying to describe with the industrial compact, the companies that were really at the forefront of that weren't, cost reducers. They were those that created new markets, new products. And that's why we had those amazing productivity growth experiences, and that's what's missing.
Daron, thank you. Nathan Payari, LSE PhD. You talked about manual workers, cognitive labor. I'm interested to know your take about AI's impact on cognitive epistemic authorities and technocrats.
On
epistemic authorities and technocrats.
So I think we really don't know what AI will do. If indeed, as many tech companies are claiming, we are in the next 10 years going to progress to AGI, artificial general intelligence, from there to artificial superintelligence, they can do everything. Technocracy, office work, creative work, science, manual work, everything. There are concerns increasingly voiced that entry-level college positions are going to be on the cutting block. I think all of those things are possible. None of that I think is going to be automatic, but I believe the real promise of AI would be in helping companies create new products and services that were not possible. And the wild card in my mind, and this is what I'm calling pro-worker AI, is actually using AI to make many crafts workers' jobs, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, blue-collar workers, technicians, nurses, much more productive because they get much more useful information. But again, that's something about the direction of technology. The future of AI is not like the weather report. It's not going to happen to us. It's about the choices that companies make.
Let's take one more question, and then I'm getting, please.
Thank you, Daron. My name is Zhen Hong. I study machine learning and systematic trading at Imperial. My question to you is in relation to the point you made in the context of community, where they are upside. In the meantime, they were downside, such as restriction of freedom to a certain point. I wanted to ask you, in a dynamic situation where community evolving from one to another, did you see any example where community people keep the upside, but minimizing the downside?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think they are generally always present, but the balance is going to be very different. The other point that is a useful background to this is that, these issues of dealing with the problems that we are grappling with today were always present in liberalism. So a very important set of debates in liberalism was about how do you treat intolerance. A different set of discussions were about how you deal with ignorance. So all of these things are about, how do you actually respect some of the diversity while at the same time perhaps hope for some changes. But it's never going to be perfect, and I think every community is always going to bring to the table some amount of trust, solidarity, etc., but at the same time some restrictions, and that's part of life, and that we have to accept that as part of the liberal life as well.
Let's take 2 questions from the left and conclude here.
Fundamental economic theory and the meritocratic ideal suggests that redistribution through taxes is both and efficient, while you suggested we should use trade unions and minimum wages and other kind of tools to redistribute income. Now, these tools imply rents that we generally dislike in economics. Are you suggesting that there is something fundamentally wrong in our economic theory that in general apply?
So thank you, that's a very good question. So essentially a celebrated theorem in economics, which goes under the name of Diamond-Murley's, says any redistribution you want to achieve is you minimize any interference with the market and then do it with taxes. And I think that breaks down if there are already existing imperfections in the economy, and most importantly, I think it breaks down when the direction of technology is endogenous, and it also breaks down when there are social concerns. So the social concerns here are non-trivial. I think if you want the communities to survive, self-government to survive, and all of these things, you really need some sort of bottom-up participation in the economy, and you're not going to achieve that by just, saying 60%, 70% of the population will not contribute to the economy, and they should just live on UBI or some other transfer program. So I think that is not going to be consistent with the self-government ideas of the community.
So the last question from the lady, please.
Hi, so my name is Karen Smirker. I am a global executive MBA student, so I'm currently getting degrees from both Columbia Business School as well as the London Business School. So my question is, it's probably good that I'm last, because a lot of these discussions have been centered around logic, and so we're approaching things from a very logical place. And as someone who lives in the United States, it is not a logical discussion that's happening right now. It's very grounded in emotion. And so my question is, how do we take these and help them overcome, truthfully, the anger that's happening in our country, and how do we apply these to have useful conversations? People aren't being assassinated because we're having logical conversations. And so how do we take this and how do we move it forward, knowing the state of what it looks like right now?
It's an excellent question, and I think part of what you're describing as many of these discussions being very emotional is about social media. So, but I do not think that it is hopeless for the following reason, that I think the way that social media has become a major amplifier of all of this disagreement is in a context in which those disagreements were already built in. So if, perhaps this is Pollyanna-ish, but if the left had changed its agenda along the lines of what I am calling sort of working class liberalism, that would actually reduce some of the tensions that are being exploited by social media. Now, there could be many impossibilities here. That change may not happen, or even if that change happened, social media could then ramp up things that perhaps amplifies it even further. I cannot rule those possibilities out, but we have no other option but try.
Let me kindly ask another political economist. So you have like 3 political economists here, so couldn't get worse.
I'm the only political economist who's not written a paper showing that democratization is good for growth.
Right.
Actually, both Elias and Daron have shown it in a rigorous way that there is a causal link between democratization to growth. So I would like to conclude this event. This is the time when I announce the next event, but that's not going to be a next event this academic year. So this is crowning lecture of the academic year. And so I would like to run a round of applause, and for all of you not to miss future events, please subscribe to the newsletter of Wheeler Institute. Thank you so much, Daron. Thank you so much.